Welcome to the online walkthrough for the Heritage Barn Grant Preservation Program for the 2019 to 21 budget biennium. My name is Jennifer Mortensen and I work for the Washington Trust for Historic Preservation. We are a statewide nonprofit advocacy organization who contracts with the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation to manage the grant program for Washington State. The Heritage Barn Grant Program is part of the Heritage Barn Preservation Initiative, which was established in 2007 by SHB 2115, and that bill did three things. It created the Heritage Barn Register, it created the Rehabilitation Grant Program, and it created the Barn Advisory Committee to review those grants. The program was established with several public benefits in mind, including retention of working landscapes and retention of heritage resources, which is achieved through easements for long-term maintenance and preservation on properties that receive grants, as well as supporting rehabilitation to provide the means for occasional public tours and events, as well as public education programs. I'm going to give a quick overview of the Heritage Barn Register before we move into the grant program, because barns are only eligible to apply for grants if they are listed on the register. The Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation retains management of the Heritage Barn Register portion of the program, and Michael Hauser, who is our state architectural historian, is the person at DAHP or DAHP who you should contact to find out if your barn is listed or how to get it listed on the register. As I mentioned before, barns must be listed on the Heritage Barn Register to be eligible to apply for a rehabilitation grant. The Heritage Barn Register defines the term heritage barn as any large agricultural outbuilding used to house animals, crops, or farm equipment that is over 50 years old. So the Heritage Barn program applies to more than just barn structures itself, and grants can be requested for structures other than barns specifically, as long as it is an agricultural outbuilding. Register eligibility is based on two factors, which are historic significance and integrity. Historic significance can come from one of these areas, or often a combination of many of these areas. These are the elements that we are looking to record in the Heritage Barn Register form when you submit that to the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation, but a barn does not necessarily need to have any sort of famous owner or builder to contribute to the agricultural history of Washington State. A barn does, however, need to have what we call integrity, which is the ability to convey that significance, convey those family stories and history, or convey the craftsmanship and design of the barn. So when we examine integrity, we first have to define those essential physical characteristics, determine which are visible and remaining, and then compare with similar properties. So because barns are quite simple structures, if one or more of those essential physical features are missing or have been replaced with modern materials, then a barn would lack integrity. Barns that have integrity have a lot of remaining historic materials. In this example, there are pieces missing, but what is remaining is original and historic. Therefore, what is remaining does have integrity. And remember that changes over time can become significant in their own right. So if there have been additions to your barn, as long as they are over 50 years old, because barns are working buildings, those things can add to the story and the historic significance of the barn and the farmstead. So here is a quick look at the register form. On the left, you see the front and back of it. It's a Word document that you fill in, and the front area here asks for physical details about the barn, roof shape and material, siding, direction and material, all those types of physical details. In the lower portion here is where you write about the history of the farm and the historic significance of it. And this section will expand as you type into it. And then on the back of the form is a grid for you to describe any outbuildings that remain and give some details about those. In addition, we require current photographs of the barn. For the register, we need one shot of each side of the barn exterior as well as interior photos, and of course any photos of particularly interesting details or architectural flourishes if those exist. We also love getting historic photos, whether it's of the barn or farmstead under construction or in use. Anything that provides that historic context is great. We also love any additional documentation of the building, like building drawings or any additional historical paraphernalia, like brochures from a farming operation or industry that existed on the farmstead. And then we also need a site plan, so just showing the relationship of all the buildings on the site to each other and also to the roadway. So the register form needs to be submitted to DAHP by September 27th in order to be listed on the register in time for the grant deadline. So if you're not already listed on the register, this would be the first step before applying for the grants. We were really proud a couple of years ago to finally have at least one barn in every county listed on the register. And this is just a quick snapshot of the distribution of barns on the register. We actually have around 750 now. There's one round of register nominations that is not included in this map, but it gives you a general idea. Now on to the barn grants. As I mentioned earlier, this is a program of DAHP and it's managed under contract by the Washington Trust for Historic Preservation, which is a statewide nonprofit. Eligible applicants for the Heritage Barn Grant Program include private property owners, leaseholders who have the permission of the property owner to do a rehabilitation project, as well as nonprofit organizations and local governments. Only cities and counties, though state entities are not eligible to apply for this program. Eligible structures are those listed on the Heritage Barn Register or the National Register of Historic Places. So you can see these bullet points relate to that. And then number 5 being in need of substantial repair. Eligible projects include the stabilization of historic barns and those expenses related to that stabilization, in particular work that preserves the historic character, features, and materials of eligible buildings. And things that are not eligible is any work that would be incompatible with the historic nature of these agricultural buildings or any new construction. I do want to emphasize that while we do not dictate use of the building for this program, any physical changes must be compatible with the historic character, and some uses require changes that are not in alignment with historic agricultural buildings. So uses that split up the interior into smaller rooms or add a lot of interior finishes like drywall or carpeting, anything that really changes the look and feel of the barn or makes it not able to convey its significance through its integrity. And this work that preserves the historic character means that all work needs to comply with the historic standards. And what that means is that we require that grant recipients repair or reinforce existing materials first to preserve as much of that original historic material as possible. So if there is a part of the barn, like a post or beam or wall framing, that is not structurally sufficient, we require that property owners look at sistering those structural elements first rather than removing and replacing. Another example is siding. Most siding deterioration happens toward the bottom of exterior walls due to rain splashback. So we require that barn owners only replace that which has absolutely deteriorated and leave anything higher off the ground that is still in good shape on the barn in place. But of course, barns are made of wood, and sometimes those materials deteriorate beyond the point of repair and must be replaced. And when that is part of a grant project, the historic standards that we follow mean that those materials must exactly replicate the original in dimension and appearance and type, which sometimes means that it will be more expensive. And that is one of the things that this grant program was designed to address, that restoring a barn with the proper materials of the proper size and dimension and historic look and feel is sometimes more expensive, and this grant program was designed to assist with making those historically correct choices instead of replacing with more modern materials. So this means that not all types of materials are appropriate, such as vinyl, some modern roofing materials. For instance, this could require barn owners to have to plane all of the wood for a siding project because the historic dimension of wood is no longer commercially available. That is an example of having to go above and beyond, but that is what this grant program is here to support. These are the evaluation criteria that the barn committee uses to review the applications. All of them are important and need to be represented in your application, but I've highlighted a few that are particularly important to convey. Number 2, the urgency of the threat and need for repair. The committee will be relying on the photographs submitted with your application to judge the urgency of your project versus other ones that they are reviewing. So it is extremely important in the photos that you submit that you demonstrate the need and urgency of your project. That typically means that you need to submit high-resolution photos, and you need to send photos that demonstrate those details and those deteriorated portions of the barn. This could include crawling underneath to take photos of a failing foundation and close-up details of that, or taking a picture from inside showing light coming through the roofing to demonstrate the need for the roofing to be replaced. In particular, I also highly recommend that you send high-resolution photographs because in the past we've received very small photos that are clearly depicting a barn but don't show any of the need or urgency because the photos were too small and we couldn't see any of the details. Number 3, the extent to which the project preserves the historic character and extends the useful life. So demonstrating that your project preserves the historic character will come in your project description. So you want to be sure to communicate to the committee that you are using the proper techniques and the proper materials as they align with the historic standards that I discussed before. So you want to not just say, replace all the siding. It would be better to describe the condition of the siding, how much you think needs to be replaced, the type of siding that you are going to be installing and how you'll be installing it, the fact that you will consciously make sure that the siding material you're using matches the historic siding exactly, all of those details to communicate to the committee that you understand the historic standards and you will be restoring your barn to those standards. And as for extending the useful life of the barn, the committee particularly prioritizes projects that will have a long-lasting effect on an agricultural structure. And this generally boils down to 3 major project areas, including foundation repair or stabilization, structural stabilization, and roof replacement or repair. So the committee will really be looking for projects like those that will have a long-lasting effect on the building. And then number 6, the readiness of the applicant to initiate and complete the project will include the fact that you understand that it's a matching and reimbursement grant, that you either have cash on hand to get started or have a means by which to take out a short-term loan or dip into savings in order to initiate the project, because the grant money is not distributed upfront. You have to do the work first and apply for reimbursement. And I will call out the special considerations, which are barns that are still in agricultural use, any barns listed on the National Register, or are outstanding examples of their type or era. A few things to be aware of for this particular program. The grant money is a one-to-one match. So what that means is for every dollar that you receive in grant funding, you have to demonstrate that you are matching that dollar yourself with either cash you are providing or donated labor, materials, or equipment to the project. Your match can be made up of a combination of a cash match or a donated match, just as long as you're demonstrating that you are matching the grant money dollar for dollar. So what this ends up meaning for your application is that you cannot request more than 50% of your total project budget. So you can only request up to half, and then you need to show that you are providing the other half. As I mentioned a minute ago, this is also a reimbursement grant, which means that you need to complete the work first and then apply for reimbursement afterward by demonstrating proof of payment and demonstrating that the work was completed. The third thing to be aware of is that a property easement is required if you do receive a grant. It is either 5, 10, or 15 years long, depending on how much grant money you receive. If it's $20,000 or under, it's 5 years. If it's $20,001 to $50,000, it's 10 years. Anything over $50,000 will be 15 years. This is a document that is filed with your property deed, and it basically says that you will maintain the property for the period of the easement, and any changes that you make to those buildings that you received grant funding for will follow the historic standards, and you will clear those major changes with staff from the Washington Trust and the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation. The property easement is part of the public benefit of this program because public dollars are going toward private property. So the state requires that you enter into this easement to make sure that property owners don't decide this year to put a new roof on a barn and then decide next year that it's really in the way and they want to tear it down. So the idea is that the easement will legally preserve that public investment for a certain period of time. In the description below, I will go ahead and link to a boilerplate version of the easement document that we require. And if you have any questions about the easement, feel free to contact me about that. So now I want to walk through the application document, starting with page 1, which has information about the property itself and its location. And moving on to sections 2 and 3, we have space for the owner's information and the applicant's information if different from the owner. So this would be in the case of perhaps parents owning property, but their children are applying for the grant and have their parents' permission to do the work. In that case, we would want both the owner's information and the applicant's information. But oftentimes the owner and the applicant are the same people, so you would only need to fill out section 2 and you could skip section 3. Section 4 is a project summary. This should be short and succinct because this will be the text that the committee members will be looking at after reviewing all of the applications in full. We create a spreadsheet database for them to reference as they are deliberating as a committee, and so it's important to have clear and succinct summary here of your project. And then section 5, the budget summary. These numbers will actually automatically tally from your budget page. So hopefully you won't need to be filling this in here. It will automatically fill in once you have your budget put together. The next page includes the historical and cultural significance portion. A lot of this information will probably be duplicated from your Heritage Barn Register form, whether you submitted it recently or were listed on the register a while ago. Either way, we want to have that historical information here for the committee to look over. If your barn was listed on the register a while ago and you happen to have new information about the history or newly uncovered information, go ahead and include it here so we can have that information updated on the state's database. For Section 7, the barn needs to be listed on the Heritage Barn Register to be eligible for a grant. You may also list if it's on the National Register, which, as I mentioned earlier, gets special consideration during the application process. So be sure to mark that here if that's the case. And then please indicate if the property is protected through any other conservation easements or any other legal arrangements that affect the property deed, just so we can determine whether or not the easement that we require would conflict with any existing property restrictions. Section 8 is the building description and the current conditions of the barn. I want to draw specific attention here to the section about use. So the original or historic use will probably be detailed in your historical significance section as well, so just summarize that here. But for the current use, you'll note, I have a note here saying funding priority is given to buildings still in agricultural use. So please try to be detailed in this section about how you're using your barn. If you say just storage, the committee won't know if that's agricultural storage and you store your tractor or other farm equipment, or if it's just household storage or something unrelated to agricultural purposes. So please take a minute to give a detailed answer to how you currently use the property, or if it's unsafe to use because of its condition, go ahead and describe how maybe you've used it in the recent past or how you plan to use it in the future. And I would also encourage in this section, if there's some portion of acreage or land that is connected to the barn, that you note the usage of that acreage if it is indeed being used for agricultural purposes. Then moving on, there is this sort of matrix here, which is basically designed for you to take a minute to examine each of the building elements of your barn and rate them between good, fair, poor, or failing. And then in the right-hand column, go ahead and make a priority ranking for each of those elements. And list the priority of, with one being the highest priority, of the elements that you consider the most in need of rehabilitation, for the committee to get a general overview of the condition of each part of your barn, and also to see if your priorities align with the committee's priorities of those sort of long-term rehabilitation project types like foundation, structural, and roofing. And the last section of the page is space for you to detail any work that you have done on the property in the past 5 years to be taken into consideration with how the committee views the urgency of your project. Applicants cannot use work that occurred before July 1st of 2019 as part of their match or toward their grant project in any way, but it does help the committee to see sort of a longer term attitude toward rehabilitation of the property. The next section is the proposed work on the project. In this section, it's really important to break your project out into discrete project phases for a couple of reasons. One, because often the committee will decide to give partial grants. So if your project did not rank among the highest, the committee may consider giving you a partial grant. And so you want to make it clear to the committee what your priorities are and what they could fund given the opportunity to award a partial grant. Another important reason is that when we put together the contract documents, we create a scope of work based on the information you provide in this section. And in order to apply for a reimbursement, it's easiest if you complete an entire phase of the overall scope of work. While we do allow mid-project reimbursements, especially for larger projects, we do request that you don't do more than 2 or 3 in the overall timeline of your project, because it's a lot of paperwork for you and it's a lot of paperwork for us. But as I mentioned earlier, it is sometimes important to get that capital partway through a project to then get those remaining phases completed. So I have a pretty thorough description of how to describe each project phase up here at the top of the page, so be sure to read that clearly. And the most important thing about this section is to be detailed in describing how you will preserve those historic features, as I mentioned earlier. So for instance, in this example, they're in pretty much every phase, they talk about matching the historic materials, custom milling siding to match, selecting roofing material to match existing materials. Everything that they describe in their project descriptions really has an eye toward those historic details, which is really important. Moving on to the budget. So this page has been redesigned a few times, and this round I have created a document that does a lot of automatic calculations. So if you have any problems with the budget or any of the automatically populating features of the document, please contact me. Let me know. I don't want anyone to be frustrated. We will find a way around it or find a way to get it working for you. So I do want to note that I made an update to this document in early September to clarify this page. So if you downloaded it previous to that, you may see some slightly different things on this page, but it shouldn't be a problem. The main differences were for the updated document, I added this grayed out number here, which basically automatically calculates half of your total project cost. So this number is the highest amount that you are allowed to ask for in a grant. So that's just for sort of calculation and reference to try to demonstrate to folks that where you are in your total project cost and what your maximum grant request can be. The other change was that I incorrectly had a greater than or equal sign here, but it should just be equal. It should be the amount of grant you're requesting and the amount of match you're providing should total to be the overall project cost. So that was just a wrong symbol that I originally inputted. So let's start by kind of identifying each area of the budget worksheet here. On the left, you have your project phases, which should automatically input from the phases listed here in these lines. And then in this column, you want to enter your estimated cost for each of those phases according to the contractor's bid that you're submitting along with your application document. And once you have your total project cost calculated here at the bottom, then you can move into the grant and matching portion where you will need to demonstrate how you plan to fund your project. So the grant that you're requesting for each phase can be listed here in these boxes. Any match in cash that you're providing would go in these boxes, and then any in-kind will go in these boxes, and these boxes will actually auto-populate from the next page, which is the in-kind match worksheet. So total project cost calculated and your maximum grant amount calculated. It's up to you to decide what you're requesting grant funding for and what you are able to match. So this sample budget actually is a good example of each budget needing to reflect your personal situation and the individual project needs. So in this particular scenario, I have for structural stabilization $10,000 listed for the grant request, which is going toward structural engineering. I have some cash match, which is purchasing some materials, and then InKind match, which is donated labor and equipment, which you'll see on the next page. And then for the roof replacement, I am planning to just pay a contractor to do the whole project from start to finish. So I'm splitting it 50-50, half grant request, half cash match. So that's just a flat out expenditure that I plan to pay out of pocket and then be reimbursed for half through the grant program. And then for these other two phases, I have them both listed as covered by match because I want the grant funding to go toward the more crucial project phase, and I will be covering the expenses for the less crucial phases with my cash match and some in-kind match. If you're not planning to donate any in-kind to your project, a lot of people feel like it makes sense to just treat each budget phase the way I've treated phase 2 here, with splitting it half grant request and half cash match, because that's just a straight up expenditure that you're paying for a contractor to complete that work. So in the scenario where you would just pay a contractor out of pocket to complete all of the work for you and not be providing any in-kind services yourself, a budget might look something like this, where each phase is actually split in half, and half is paid for in grant money and half is paid for in cash match. This is also a really easy way to go about structuring your budget. You'll also notice that this bumped up the total grant request to the maximum, which would be the case if you were splitting every estimated cost in half between grant funding and cash matching. Budget example, I have a couple of different scenarios where in the first line I have more than half of grant funding going towards structural stabilization with some cash match and some in-kind match. It all depends on how you are planning to proceed with the project, how much cash you are planning to spend as a match, and how much labor, materials, and equipment you're planning to donate to the project. All in all, the most important thing is to demonstrate that you have at least as much total match provided as you are requesting in grant funds. So however you distribute the funding between grant expenses, cash match expenses, or in-kind donations, that will vary with every project and every personal financial situation. So if you have any questions or are confused about how to structure your budget, I would be happy to clarify how to work with this spreadsheet within your specific project budget. If you do plan to donate labor, materials, or equipment to your project, however, you will need to fill out the in-kind donation worksheet, which is the next page. You'll see for the sample budget, all the phases are here on the sheet. These will again automatically populate. And then in these yellow cells, go ahead and fill in the approximate value of the labor, materials, or equipment you plan to donate for each phase. These yellow cells will automatically tally for each row, and then kind of work. So here under structural stabilization, I've got 200 hours of carpentry and drafting work valued at $25 an hour by the owner, plus 1 month use of a scissor lift at $700 a month. So don't just put the numbers in there. Give us a good description of each phase and what you're planning to donate. You can see in the roof replacement, there's no donations for that one. And then the descriptions here in the third and fourth phase. So once you get this all filled out and get your approximate dollar values in the yellow cells, they tally to the blue cells. These blue cells will then populate back into the main budget page in the InKind match column. So that's another automated auto-populating feature of the form. The next section is the proposed project timeline and readiness to proceed. So first, I will note that while applications are due October 23rd, the grant awards will not actually be announced until December. And after those awards are announced, it does take a few months to get each grant recipient under contract with the state. Grant recipients should not begin any work that they plan to have reimbursed by the grant money until after that contract is signed. As I mentioned, work completed after July 1st of 2019, which is inside of the biennium grant cycle, can count towards your match, but any expenses that you plan to have reimbursed by the grant program cannot begin until the contracts are signed. So getting under contract does take a few months with all of the grant recipients. So realistically, work will likely not be able to begin until spring of 2020. So in this example, I have some dates called out here and just showing the order of each phase and how long I'm estimating that it will take to complete each phase. These dates are more estimates than sort of a rigid schedule to follow, but we want to get an idea of what you're thinking for your project and how you are planning for it to proceed. And you'll notice that these phases will actually automatically populate from the phases that you've proposed in the work description section. And you'll notice here that the non-historic canopy is actually happening first because it makes sense to take that off before other work begins. So just let us know how you plan to structure the project and move through it. So for this section, our funds currently committed. Let us know your plans for financing the project because it is a reimbursement grant. So how will you have the capital to get the project started in the beginning? And that's something I mentioned before about readiness to proceed being a key feature that the committee looks for. So if you do not have funds currently committed to begin the project and you mark no for any reason, use this space down here to explain why, that you're applying for a loan, that you intend to do a mid-project reimbursement to get funds to begin that next phase. Just give us a good picture of your financial ability to get the project going, since you do have to fund half of it and basically has to be funded up front by you, and then the grant funds can be reimbursed later. In section 12, please list your experience if you plan to do any work. And then if you are hiring a contractor, please go ahead and list their contact information here, and also include an attachment that details their qualifications and professional experience. The contractor's bid that you submit with this application does not necessarily need to be the contractor that you use in the project. If for some reason you change your mind or you decide to do more of the work yourself, or you just find a different contractor that you prefer to work with. But we do need to have a bid for the application phase to basically justify the budget that you have put together for your project, to have a professional assessment of the project overall. And then in the last section here, section 13, go ahead and let the committee know how critical the grant funds are to the project proceeding. If you got no funding or partial funding, just let us know what your plans would be if you did not receive all of the grant money that you are requesting. Section 14 is public benefit, and each of these are elements of the program I mentioned earlier, but this is an important section to be aware of. So for 14A, definitely list what road it's visible on here, and as one of your photograph attachments, show a picture of your barn from the public right-of-way, from the public road. This is a really important piece for the committee to see that there's public access to a view of your barn, because this funding is public funding. B involves the easement that you will be required to enter into if you receive a grant, and you need to mark yes for here. So before we proceed with awarding grant funds, we need to have a confirmation from the applicant that yes, you are aware of the easement and that you will enter into it if you do receive funds. If you mark no here, I will probably call you or follow up with you to ask why, because you need to have marked yes in order to be considered for this grant program. And then C is discussing public access. The only public access that's required through the grant program is that view from the public right-of-way, but we do love to see when barns are open to the public for events or educational opportunities, so be sure to detail any public access here that you provide through any programming or events. And then D, go ahead and describe sort of the near-term preservation plan for the barn if you have other work that you plan to do, and any ongoing maintenance plan you have for the property, whether that's just regular maintenance through active use or any sort of planned future projects. And then section 15 is just any additional information that you weren't able to share anywhere in the rest of the application, but you think is important for the committee to know. We wanted to provide a section for you to do that here. And section 16 is the list of required attachments. These are all very important to include as they are described here. So number one is the contractor bids, estimates, or assessments used to develop your proposal and your budget. Please include copies of those for the committee to see, again, to basically justify the amount of grant funds that you are requesting. Number two, include any images or product pages for the proposed materials. This is an important feature to include so that the committee sees that you understand what types of materials are allowed through the grant program, what are not. If you have any questions about something that may or may not be allowed, please contact me, ask me. You can just shoot me some links and I'm happy to give feedback right away so that you're not submitting incorrect materials. Number three is a one-page summary of experience working with historic buildings for selected architects, engineers, or contractors. So this is if you are planning to hire professional services, please go ahead and have them provide a one-page summary of their professional qualifications. Number four, I have a text document with image captions and descriptions that correspond to the image file names. The image captions are important so that the committee understands what you are presenting in your photographs, because as I mentioned earlier, the photographs, in addition to sort of orienting the committee to the property and the buildings, they really are the only thing that can demonstrate the urgency of the project and demonstrate the need for the grant. So be sure to give good image captions that describe what you have listed in each photo so the committee can follow along with your proposal and your project. And for those images, number 5, please include 4 high-resolution images of each side of the building. So that's so we can get a sort of a 360 view of the entire building, so we can see the whole exterior. And then, as I mentioned before, it's really important for number 6, the detail images, to convey the need for the grant. So you really want to clearly illustrate the conditions of the barn that are motivating you to apply for the grant and justify the need for the grant. So the deteriorated foundation, or again, the light through the roofing to demonstrate the need for new roofing. Feel free to send a variety of photos that demonstrate that need. And number 7, as I mentioned before, one of the big public benefits is a view of the grant funding from a right-of-way. So please do send at least one image of the barn from the nearest public road. If there's multiple public roads, it would be great to see the view of the barn from each of those roads, each of those different vantage points. This is a really important thing for the committee to see. For any local government applicants, please include number 8, a brief profile of the department mission, lead staff, and annual budget. And any nonprofit applicants should include 9 and 10, list of board members, and your annual operating budget. On the certification page, most applicants will probably only need to fill out this section here. If it's a private owner, one individual or perhaps 2 individuals, any owners of the property will need to sign here in the owner section. If the legal owning entity is an LLC, if the barn is actually technically owned by the farm or business, go ahead and list that here, the representative's signature, title, and printed name. And then again, if there is an applicant who is actually different from the owner, for instance, a family member, go ahead and have the applicant sign here if that is the case. For the application submission, you will need to submit both hard copy and digital materials for this grant. This is all detailed in the guidelines and procedures document, so you can see this all listed out there as well. The hard copy materials need to be a completed grant application with original signatures, and this needs to be printed out and signed with a pen by the legal owner, and if there is a separate applicant, the applicant as well. And then all attachments except for images. So that includes, a printed out copy of your bids, a printed out copy of your contractor's qualifications and your materials pages, and all of that extra supplemental information that demonstrates your project. These hard copy materials need to be mailed to our office at 1204 Minor Avenue in Seattle, postmarked by the application deadline, which is October 23rd, 2019. We also require digital submission of materials, so we'll need a digital copy of your grant form, which you do not need to try to do signatures on this copy. I would far prefer sending the original form that you actually are typing your information into, so I can easily transfer the information in your application document to my spreadsheet and database. So this does not need to be a printed, signed and scanned copy. Just go ahead and send us the form that you are actually working in and typing into. We'll also need digital copies of all the attachments, so a digital copy of those bids and materials pages and contractor qualifications, and then all of the high-resolution digital images and the image captions documents submitted digitally as well. So please don't worry about printing your images. Just go ahead and send us all of the image files digitally, and please make those as high-resolution as possible. A lot of even phone cameras have a pretty great capacity these days, so hopefully this won't be too difficult for most applicants to achieve or get someone to help them with. So for those digital materials, go ahead and submit them through this form on our website. This is my preferred mode of submission because I, especially around the time of the due date, will be getting a very high volume of emails. So submitting via the website will assure that your information makes it into our database. And now I want to go ahead and show some of the pictures from previous barn grant projects. Kind of one of the funnest parts of the program is to see some of those before and afters. So this is the Heidenreich Dairy out in Colfax in Whitman County. This is the before, and this is the really stunning after shot. And you can see that this grant chose to go ahead and use wood shingles, and it just looks marvelous. This is another example of a roof replacement at Nina's Barn in Squim. Here are a couple of interesting historic photos that were also submitted, showing that the barn was never actually enclosed with walls. And then here's the barn today with a really nice looking metal roof that still really matches the historic character of the barn. Even if the original material was shingles, this metal roofing still looks great and definitely meets the historic standards of the program. The Olson Long Ranch is an interesting example of a pretty unique foundation structure that had collapsed, and the owners really went above and beyond to repair and reinforce this historical foundation style and really preserve that historic character of the barn with this really great rock and timber foundation system. The Prevdale barn in Cedro Woolley is a great example of what I mentioned earlier about only replacing what needs to be replaced. So you can see here that just the lower portion of the siding that had more severely deteriorated was replaced on this barn. So all of the upper material here and siding is all still original and is all still in really great shape for this barn. And the added new material matches in dimension to the historic material, and in just a couple of years, you won't be able to tell the difference as that wood ages and weathers. Here's another piece of that project where there were more modern concrete footers that were installed in the barn to sort of upgrade that foundation. And here are some detail shots from the Prevdale barn. And last, but certainly not least, one of our sort of poster grant examples is the Calf Creek Ranch. So this is the condition of the barn when it received a grant. And then after some adverse weather, this was the condition of the barn a few months later. And we honestly thought that this grant project was over and that this was now becoming salvage material only, but the owner was determined and happened to have a friend with a crane and decided that they would lift the barn back up, and miraculously a lot of the framing and siding actually basically snapped back into place. There was certainly some damage, but a lot of it was able to be salvaged and reused because it wasn't totally broken. And now this is the barn after the grant project was completed, and you can see that an updated metal roof as well as painting was also part of the project. So this is a really stunning sort of extreme example of a before and after, and one we're really proud to have been a part of. So please contact me if you have any questions or comments about the paperwork or the committee and their priorities or any other issues with the grant program. I'm available to respond to email or phone. Usually I'm a little bit faster with email, so that is the preferred way to answer quick questions. If there's a more involved conversation, please do feel free to give me a call. And be sure to check out the description of this video for lots of relevant links to documents and other information that might be helpful, and also my contact information. I'm here to help and hopefully make your application process go smoothly and help everyone put forward the sort of best and most competitive grant application that they can. So thanks for watching, and I hope this was helpful. Bye-bye.